My historic figure was Jacques Derrida. He was born in July 1930s. His father was Haim Aran and mother was Sultana Safar. He was born in El Bair, French Algeria, in Jewish family. He married in 1957 to Margarita, and then 1985 he got a son from Sylviane. Then 1949 he moved to France to complete his education. He entered the École Normale Supérieure, if I pronounce it correctly, and he taught English and French from 1957 to 1959 as a military service. Then he became permanent instructor at the same school in 1964. He gave a speech to Cornell and Johns Hopkins University students about his philosophy and his approach, and the result of that speech became of grammatology, and for the first time he introduced the term deconstructionist or deconstructionism. His belief about philosophy was he believed philosophy must detach itself from side effects of its time and human pathology. He always insisted why philosophers never indicated their own gender in their writings. His influence in the art, architecture, and all end up to be transition from modernism to be postmodernism era. So Jacques Derrida's philosophy of deconstructionism became very influential in the transition time of modernism to postmodernism. And he used language and linguistics as a means of accessing mind. His tools and the means of accessing to meaning of the words was from linguistics and eventually semiotics. So he influenced the linguistics, literature, art and design, architecture, and so on. So many different disciplines and majors that all got influenced by it. These are samples of the works resulted of the deconstruction became the postmodernist era graphic design and architecture. What's deconstructionism? Fisher and Graham refers to postmodernism, which deconstruction is a part of it, as at the point in which society is not inventing anything new anymore and only recycling old ideas. And of course, artists and historians and thinkers always explore the analytical thinking to represent, and deconstructionism became one of the approaches, or maybe only approach, to offer such an approach. Peters states that Derrida introduced the term deconstruction in his book of grammatology for the first time, and it was the translation of a destruction word, German word, from Heidegger. That means, or generally refers to, coming from ancient Oriental word or saying that a language that has reached its perfection had deconstructed and deformed itself by the sole law of change, a law natural to human mind. So we all doomed to be changed. Deconstructionists explore the truth in meaning. So meaning is very important. So analyzing meanings becomes a real fundamental approach that introduced by deconstructionism. And they insist against the philosophy of spoken language over the written language by ancient and classical philosophers. So deconstruction emphasized a more written language than over spoken language. As Plato always cherished the dialogue over conversation, but Derrida argued that Plato eventually writes his dialogues, not just spoken. And the Powell says, out of the full presence of my pure consciousness flow my thoughts. From my thoughts flow my speech. From my speech flow my writings. So eventually the perfection, perhaps we can say, is the writings over speech. I have to indicate that the reason philosophers insist on speech, they believe the speech is directly connected to the author and is coming from the soul. Derrida looks at the structure and process of language and meaning, and re-evaluating all Western philosophy. That's number one, insisting and objectives. The second is the written form of language survives far longer the author itself. So even though spoken language is connected to the soul of the speaker, but the written language lasts longer and can affect the culture eventually later on. and investigating classic Western dialectics, such as poetry. That was the third objectives or basics of the Jacques Derrida's deconstructionism. Ferdinand de Saussure, the linguist, Swiss linguist, introduced that words are signifiers, and translation is another form of understanding that words can change the container or form but convey the same message. So words are changing, but the meaning stays, and sometimes shift, but not completely. The signifieds are most important, the objects that words are referring to that. That was the basics of semiotics and then analysis of the semiotics. And the word differente, introduced by Jacques Derrida, it's sometimes pronounced different, but it's not the same. Differente means the binary oppositions that exist in each other, writing versus speech, and the same. We can argue the same similarity of the yin and yang. And the negative lives inside the positive. So how we pull the negative outside the positive, that became the soul of deconstruction that introduced by the graphic design and architecture to the entire rest of the outside the philosophy. Jacques Derrida used semiotics of a sign, signifier, and signified as a means to discuss his arguments. And then later on, Peirce introduced representment and interpretant, complementing the sign, signifier, and signified. Semiotics introduced icons, index, and symbols, which is a really long discussion altogether, and it's not going to fit in 10 minutes. Index, icon, and symbols are the three ways of approaching the meaning of the words and how we perceive the vocabularies and objects relating to that. In 1988, deconstructionists introduced relationship between philosophy and architecture by Deconstructionist Architectural Design exhibition in New York. And then eventually, Herbert Spencer, the author of the Pioneers of Modern Typography, introduced the typography and graphic design deconstruction to the world by publishing this. The ultimate purpose of deconstructionism was defining the words and meanings all over again and again and again. So we are not always fixed in one meaning and only one meaning. So the approach that Jacques Derrida took, it's an approach. He believed and insists that it's not a methodology or method, it's just an approach, and an approach that can show opposing meaning applies to even deconstruction itself. It's an interesting one. Deconstruction approach applied and influenced and affected almost all over the disciplines, entire world, from politics all the way to art, from economy to education, psychology and language, and so on. And still goes on to redefine itself. And the new approach that I'm part of, believers, is a reconstructionism that believes we are not deconstructing only, especially in creative field, we deconstruct and then go back and reconstruct a new form and new content, and all those definitions that we had has to be reapproached. So I'm actually not hoping, I learned a lot by going through this research all over again and rediscovered something new, and it was wonderful. Thanks for listening. I hope to hear from you guys, your comments. Thank you.